Most people assume emotional affairs should be easy to end because nothing physical is happening. But psychology tells a very different story. In many cases, emotional affairs can feel even harder to walk away from than physical ones. What makes them so powerful is not just attraction, it's the psychological connection that forms when two people begin sharing thoughts, frustrations, and emotional attention that normally belong inside a committed relationship. Over time, that connection can quietly reshape how the brain experiences closeness, validation, and belonging. By the end of this exploration, you will understand why emotional affairs become so difficult to end, what happens inside the brain during these hidden connections, and why people often feel deeply attached even when they know the situation is risky or complicated. To understand this pattern, it helps to begin with how emotional intimacy works. Human beings form bonds through shared vulnerability. When someone listens carefully, remembers details, and responds with understanding, the brain interprets that interaction as safety and connection. Emotional affairs often begin in ordinary settings. It might be a coworker who listens during stressful moments, a friend who offers support during relationship difficulties, or someone online who seems to understand personal struggles. At first, the connection feels harmless. But small interactions begin to build emotional momentum. Messages become longer, conversations become more personal. Gradually, topics appear that are not shared with anyone else. The brain begins associating that person with comfort and emotional relief. Here's something important to notice. Emotional affairs rarely begin with the intention to betray a partner. They usually begin with emotional openness that slowly deepens over time. Because the shift happens gradually, people often don't recognize when the connection crosses an invisible boundary. The brain responds strongly to emotional attention. When someone feels heard, valued, and understood, the reward system becomes active. Dopamine and oxytocin increase, reinforcing the bond and encouraging the mind to seek more of those interactions. This creates the first psychological loop. The person begins looking forward to conversations with the other individual. A message notification creates anticipation. A thoughtful reply creates emotional reward. Over time, these moments become part of daily emotional life. Pause for a moment and ask yourself something. If someone consistently provides emotional support during stressful moments, how quickly might the brain start associating that person with comfort and relief? This is where emotional affairs gain their power. The connection becomes linked to emotional regulation. When the person feels frustrated, lonely, or misunderstood, they turn toward the other individual for support. The brain begins treating that person as a safe emotional outlet. Another factor that strengthens the bond is selective presentation. In everyday life, people show their full range of moods and stress. But emotional affairs often exist in controlled conversations where both individuals show their most thoughtful and attentive sides. Without the daily pressures of shared responsibilities, the connection feels unusually smooth. Disagreements are rare, emotional support is consistent. Over time, the brain begins to idealize the interaction. This idealization can create a distorted comparison with existing relationships. Long-term partners share responsibilities, stress, and real-life conflict. When the emotional affair exists outside those pressures, the connection can appear unusually easier and more fulfilling. But that ease is often an illusion created by context. The relationship is protected from the everyday demands that test long-term partnerships. Because those pressures are missing, the connection can feel unusually harmonious. Another reason emotional affairs are difficult to end involves emotional disclosure. When people share personal fears, frustrations, and vulnerabilities, they create a powerful sense of intimacy. The brain interprets these exchanges as deep trust. The more personal the conversations become, the stronger the emotional attachment grows. Secrets, hopes, and private thoughts begin to circulate within that connection. Ending the relationship can feel like losing someone who truly understands you. Let me ask you something worth reflecting on. If someone becomes the person you share your deepest thoughts with, what does it feel like to suddenly remove them from your life? The answer often explains why emotional affairs linger. Walking away can feel similar to losing a close friend or confidant. Even when someone knows the relationship should end, the emotional loss feels real. There is also the psychological pull of unfinished stories. Emotional affairs often exist in a space of possibility rather than reality. Because the relationship rarely faces practical challenges, the mind fills in the missing pieces with imagination. People may wonder what life would be like if the connection became real. They imagine deeper conversations, shared experiences, or emotional closeness that feels effortless. These imagined possibilities keep the mind engaged. Here is the surprising part. Sometimes people are not only attached to the person in the emotional affair, they're attached to the version of themselves that appears in that relationship. In those conversations, they may feel more interesting, more understood, or more emotionally expressive. The interaction highlights parts of their personality that daily life may not emphasize. When the connection ends, it can feel like losing access to that version of themselves. This psychological shift can make the separation feel even more difficult. Emotional affairs also involve secrecy, which intensifies emotional experience. When a connection must be hidden, the brain interprets it as more significant. Secrecy creates tension and anticipation that amplify emotional reactions. Each message or conversation feels more meaningful because it exists within that hidden space. The brain begins associating the person with excitement and emotional intensity. Another important factor is emotional contrast. After spending time in a deeply validating conversation, returning to everyday life can feel quiet or routine by comparison. The brain notices this difference and begins craving the emotional intensity again. This does not mean the existing relationship lacks value. It simply reflects how novelty and focused attention influence emotional perception. The brain reacts strongly to interactions that feel new, exciting, or emotionally rewarding. Have you ever noticed how people sometimes underestimate the value of what they already have when something new captures their attention? This is a common human tendency. The mind naturally amplifies novelty while becoming accustomed to stability. Emotional affairs take advantage of this pattern because they exist almost entirely in the realm of novelty. Despite all these psychological forces, emotional affairs can still be understood and addressed with awareness. Recognizing the patterns behind the attachment helps remove some of the illusions surrounding the connection. When people step back and examine the situation clearly, they often realize that much of the emotional intensity comes from context rather than destiny. The brain has been responding to attention, novelty, and emotional validation. The deeper insight is that those same elements can exist within healthy relationships. When partners intentionally listen, share openly, and remain curious about each other, emotional closeness can grow stronger over time. The difference is that those connections exist in the open, where honesty and trust support the relationship rather than secrecy. Understanding the psychology of emotional affairs reveals something important about human nature. People are deeply influenced by attention, understanding, and emotional presence. When those needs are met consistently, powerful bonds form. But when those needs are met in hidden spaces, the mind can create attachments that feel confusing and difficult to break. The key lesson is not simply about avoiding emotional affairs. It's about recognizing how emotional attention shapes connection. When people become aware of these psychological patterns, they gain the ability to make choices that align with their values rather than emotional impulses. If these ideas made you reflect on how emotional bonds form, take a moment to consider them carefully. Human relationships are often shaped by subtle psychological forces that operate beneath everyday conversations. Feel free to share your thoughts or perspectives in the comments. Conversations about human behavior often reveal insights many people quietly experience but rarely discuss. And if exploring the psychology behind relationships helps you better understand the patterns of connection and attachment, consider subscribing to continue learning about the hidden dynamics that shape human behavior.